Okay, joined here. We're on Zoom with Jonathan Helton. How you doing, Jonathan?
I am doing great. How are you, Jeff?
Pretty good. We've chatted a bit. You actually reached out to me it was a few months ago after I wrote in my Sunday column about how much I hated the Jones Act, which actually was the Passenger Vessel Services Act in this case. And you reached out to me, and you're with the Grassroot Institute in Hawaii. So maybe
Yes, that's correct.
talk a little bit about that, your background, and then we're going to talk about the Jones Act and the Passenger Vessel Services Act, which both have big impacts on Alaska and Hawaii, among other states.
Yes, they definitely do. The Grassroots Institute of Hawaii is a nonprofit think tank, and we're interested in advancing economic freedom, and, individual liberty, accountable government in the state of Hawaii. And in this case, we're looking at the federal issue of the Jones Act because it does impact states like Alaska, Hawaii, and then territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, especially harder than it impacts the rest of the nation.
So, how long have you been with the? This is kind of a pretty niche type issue. Most people probably don't
Yes,
even.
it is for sure. I've been working with the Grassroots Institute on the Jones Act for coming up on 4 years now.
Okay, so let's talk about both of these things. There's the Jones Act, and then the Passenger
Mhm.
Vessel Services Act. Now, the Jones Act applies to cargo, and the Passenger
Yes.
Vessel Service Act applies to passengers. Talk a little bit about what that means for kind of ships and like where they're built and how they can function in the United States.
Right. So the Jones Act, I think most people are a little bit more familiar with it. And it simply requires that all ships that are moving goods between two US points have to be ships that are built in the United States, flagged in the United States, and then be mostly owned and crewed by American citizens. And so, as you said, that applies to cargo. And the PVSA, the Passenger Vessel Services Act, is very similar. It's essentially the same thing, all those same requirements, but applies to the transportation of passengers.
Now, the Jones Act is like a post World War One, almost like a protectionist law in the 1920. But the Passenger Vessel Service Act goes back to the 1800s, right? The 19.
Yeah, 1886, I believe. Although it's worth pointing out, people say the Jones Act goes back to 1920, which it does, but both of these laws come from a history of what are called cabotage laws that were instituted shortly after the nation was founded. So there's been some version of these laws ever since the United States has been a country. Um, Now, they may have had a good justification back then, but in the 21st century, these laws don't work very well because, as you said, the Jones Act is post World War One. It hasn't really been updated since, and neither has the PVSA, which is even older.
Well, the reason this kind of came, and I've known about this for a long time. I think there was a study many years ago that looked at Alaska and Hawaii, and I think they kind of concluded that the Jones Act hits each family in Alaska or Hawaii to the tune of $2,000 or $3,000 per year, and the cost of kind of increased cost of goods for shipping on these ships, American made ships. Now you could have a foreign ship, and all these cruise ships are foreign, built and flagged, but they just can't go from port to port and U.S. port to port and um, unload goods or people unless they
Right.
unless they
Yes.
stop at a foreign port. Like that's why all these cruise ships,
Yes.
end in Canada. Um,
Yeah, so that's the quirk of the PVSA. So the Jones Act is pretty straightforward. If you unload a barrel of oil in California, you want to move that barrel of oil to Hawaii, you have to do that on a U.S. You have to do that on a Jones Act ship. For the PVSA, as you said, it gets a little bit more complicated
with the
because
Jones Act,
there's a bunch.
can you start in California and then stop in Canada and then go to Hawaii or no?
No, you can't.
So it's got to be from Hawaii, California to Hawaii or back and forth. It's got to be a U.S. built, U.S. flagship.
Yeah, if you're moving cargo between any two U.S. points, it has to be one of those Jones Act ships.
Okay,
So, as
no.
I said, the Jones Act is rather straightforward. The PVSA is not. The PVSA is like Swiss cheese when it comes to its loopholes. So, right, so if you have a cruise ship moving from Seattle to Alaska, that what they're able to do is they're able to take advantage of a loophole that allows them to make a quick stop in a foreign port, which in this case is usually Vancouver. They make a simple stop, and then they're able to continue on their merry way. But as a part of that stop, the condition is if you're a foreign ship that does not comply with the PVSA, you make a stop at a foreign port, you can't offload passengers at another U.S. port. So all of these tourists who are sailing between Seattle and Alaska, under the law, none of them are allowed to disembark in ports in Alaska. They can get off and walk around, but they have to get back on the ship, and they can only disembark at either a foreign port or Seattle.
Well, and this is
So
kind of the crux
hopefully
of
that's
why,
not too confusing, but
well, this is the crux of why I wrote, I guess it was September, 6 weeks ago. I went on a cruise. There was a Holland America did an offering for Alaska residents, kind of a pretty cheap at the end of season fare from Whittier to Vancouver, and I jumped on it. I was like, oh, it was like $1,000 all in for a week, room, food, everything. And then I had a lady friend who was going to come with me, but she couldn't go to Vancouver because she had to get off and go back for the weekend, and she to work in Anchorage. She was going to fly back from Juneau to Anchorage. And I told the cruise people this, and they said, okay, well, there needs to be, they called it a Jones Act exemption, but I mean, it's really Passenger Vessel Services Act exemption. So
yeah,
I said, here's her information, here's the plan, blah, blah. And you can get exemptions, and it's not through the cruise ship company, it's through the customs, it's through the federal government.
yeah.
So we get to Whittier, explain it again, and they hadn't processed the exemption. They the customs didn't, and it was 10 days, I think, before the cruise that I asked for it.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't let, I mean, they basically said, if you get on the ship and you get off and don't get back on, it's like, I think it was like $1,000 fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean,
You have to pay.
I think it's like a $700 something fine, but I mean, the cruise ship could have added on its own fee on top of the legal fee for that. Yeah.
It just seems so kind of ridiculous to me that people can't just, I mean, what if you get sick? I mean, I'm sure people get sick, or maybe people forget to get on the boat. I mean, I guess they have to go to the next port or fly. I mean, they have to figure it out, but I mean, this must happen.
Yes, no, I mean it does happen, and there's been several instances where I think there was an instance just last month where a cruise ship left a port in Southern California, and it was going to head down to one of the ports in Mexico to make the foreign stop. But I believe there was some unrest in Mexico at that time, so the cruise ship they didn't want to stop in the port in Mexico, so they had to turn around. So
Oh,
I'm
really? So did they
sure
get like
on the background.
so
Yeah, I was gonna say on the background, I'm sure they got some sort of workaround through Customs and Border Protection, but that's not something the media has covered. So you kind of see the initial story, and then nothing ever comes out because the cruise lines sure get with their lawyers, get with Customs, and then they hash that out.
yeah, I didn't hear about that. Now the one thing that we did hear a lot about last summer was Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator Dan Sullivan, and Don Young, who's now passed away. They were very outspoken about this issue with Canada and the cruise ships and not letting cruise ships in. And then, for Alaska, cruise ship, is a huge part of our tourist market. And they had, Congress had
Hawaii
passed,
too.
basically, the Congress had basically passed an exemption or a temporary kind of halting of the Passenger Vessel Services Act for ships going from Seattle to Alaska back and forth because they couldn't stop it because the Canadians were like crazy with this COVID shit, and they were, shutting. I mean, they only a few, like last month, only finally kind of fully opened things up. I flew back from Vancouver, and this is in September, and they still are making you wear the masks.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a week later they finally. But I mean, Canada was kind of way out there on this stuff. So the government, the Congress actually did pass a temporary lifting or halting of this PVSA, but it was only temporary.
Yeah, it was. And now, thankfully, so Lisa Murkowski has proposed a bill. I can pull up the title real quickly. The bill is called the Cruising for Alaska's Workforce Act. So she proposed this bill last fall after that temporary exemption had lapsed. And what Murkowski's bill would do, it would exempt Alaska from the PVSA entirely until a large U.S. flag cruise ship entered the market. And I think that's worth pointing out because the PVSA, the Jones Act, one of the main rationales behind these laws is that they protect U.S. national security. They're supposed to ensure a fleet of vessels that the United States can use in times of war. But there's no large cruise ships that are protected by this law. And so, I mean, Murkowski's bill was pretty common sense. It hasn't passed, but she did say if she's reelected, she's going to propose it again in the next Congress. So, I mean,
Well, that's
there's
what I
the
want.
possibility.
That's what I wanted to talk about. You know, the PVSA is passengers, and then the Jones Act. And I talked to somebody who's a longtime maritime guy, and I mentioned how dumb I think these are. But he made a good point, and what you just kind of touched on is there probably is some reason or some rationale for having, you know, American-made ships be around, especially in time of war. You know, having a naval fleet is important. But I mean, I think you could still do that and have, you know, American built naval vessels and ships, and then also allow good. And I guess the other concern is if you have, you know, foreign ships moving our goods and our oil and our you know, products around, and there's a war with some country, then they would have, like, you know, us around. They would have like a stranglehold on us for you know, essentially moving our resources around, which I guess, you know, makes some sense too. You want to have your own ships and your own people be able to take care of, you know, the needs of the country, of the resources. But I don't know. I mean, I understand the national security aspect, and I think it makes some sense. But I just kind of question: why does it apply to everything?
Yes, no, and that's a legitimate question. And you know, the Jones Act and the PVSA, they don't apply to U.S. military vessels. That's a separate law. So if these laws were reformed, you'd still have the Navy building all of its ships in the United States. But I think there's a couple of questions you know we need to consider when we talk about national security. With the PVSA, there is one, and that's a very special ship we can talk about later. There's one large cruise ship that actually complies with the law. And that cruise ship is only operating in Hawaii. So it's not really this law is not really protecting anyone. There's no shipyards that are staying in business because they're building large cruise ships.
All
So
these
with the
big
Jones Act,
all these big cruise ships we
go
see,
ahead.
especially in Alaska, they're kind of flagged in like Bahamas or Liberia, and they're built, you know, they're built in other places where it's cheaper. I mean, the taxes are probably,
Yeah, you know,
actually, and this is another thing. Does that me or you? I'm hearing some feedback.
I think that's probably me. Sorry.
No problem. So, I will say that when the COVID happened, all these ships are flagged in, like I said, Bahamas or Liberia or wherever. I kind of thought it was a little bit preposterous. They were asking for all of these bailouts from the government. They don't pay any much taxes here because they're flagged abroad, right? They're flagged in these like lower tax countries. But it's also cheaper to build these ships and have these ships flagged in other countries.
Yeah, it definitely is. You know, I think Europe has a pretty big portion of the cruise ship building market, and then I think that East Asia does as well. So yeah, I mean, Europe's, you know, a lot of those countries have similar standards of living to the United States, but even there, they've been building cruise ships for quite a while, so they've got the skill that keeps them competitive. Where the United States, we just don't. The last large cruise ship that was completed in a U.S. shipyard was in the 1950s.
Really?
That's how long ago it was. So so this law is not protecting anyone, right? And it hasn't for 60 years, pretty much.
Does Europe have? Do you know if countries in Europe have similar laws?
Yes. So most countries in the world have some sort of cabotage law where they give some sort of preference to ships that are flying their flag.
Mm-hmm.
But the EU is special because you have all of these member states, and so a lot of times what the EU will do is they will allow ships from member states to operate kind of like domestically, right?
Okay.
And the other thing that's worth noting, most countries do not require that ships flying their flag and operating in their domestic commerce be built. The United States is one of the few countries that has what we call a domestic build requirement for its vessels.
So who I can see on the Jones Act side, I can see who would be interested in keeping that around. But I mean, what lobby or what group is interested in keeping the PVSA around? I mean, it sounds like it's not really protecting anybody. So why is it still around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As far as we can tell, there are some groups in Canada, really, that want to keep it around. You see this because I think the
Oh, sure,
reports
yeah,
were
because you
saying
got to
that Vancouver,
because you got to stop in Canada.
yeah, they get, I think, $2 billion a year because cruise ships stop there. So they have incentive to, and there's been some reports that Canada has lobbied Congress on this. But I'll give you an example. This was uh, within the past 2 months. There was a country in Central America, I believe it was Panama, and there was news that they had hired a lobbying firm to lobby Congress to amend the PVSA to designate Panama as a distant foreign port. And so that's important because if Panama was considered a distant foreign port under the PVSA, a cruise ship could pick up passengers in San Diego, California. It could sail them down to Panama. It could run through the Panama Canal, and then it could drop them off in Florida. And because Panama was considered a distant foreign port, so in Panama's eyes, they're looking at this as a way to get tourist revenue. If we can change our legal status under the PVSA, then we're going to get money.
Wait,
That's
wait.
that makes sense from their point of view.
So under the PVSA, you have to like these ports have to be designated. It can't just be any foreign port.
Yes. So it's they're right. You have the loophole of a stop in a foreign port, but it gets even more complicated because there's two kinds of foreign ports. There's either a nearby foreign port, which would be Canada, or Mexico. Those are two common ones that cruise lines stop in. Or there's distant foreign ports, which, I mean, think New Zealand. For example, cruise line picks up passengers in California, sails to Hawaii. They visit Hawaii. It is a cruise around the entire globe. They visit New Zealand, somewhere in Africa. Because they visited those two distant foreign ports, they're able to disembark passengers at the U.S. East Coast or at a port that they did not pick the passengers up at.
So those
So
are you saying that New Zealand and some countries in Africa, they're designated like ports that are distant or
yeah,
comply?
they would be considered distant. And right now, Panama is considered a nearby foreign port. So they're essentially considered the same as a stop in Canada would be. And if they change that, and they think they can probably make some money off of it.
Also, if you're distant, you can disembark people back in the U.S., but if you're nearby, you can't disembark people.
Yeah, so if you're nearby, you can only disembark them in the same port where you embarked them at. So that's why all of these cruises from Seattle start and end in Seattle. But if you're distant, you can disembark them at a different port than you picked them up at.
It just seems so, I don't know, it just seems so kind of convoluted. I wonder why, I really wonder why this
Yeah,
was maintained, stuck around for so long when, like I
and
said, the Jones Act,
that's a great point. Yeah, I was gonna say the Jones Act, the Jones Act is straightforward. The Jones Act has a lot of costs, but there's a debate that has more of two sides. This one, the PVSA is just flat out confusing. And you see who benefits from it. It's a foreign country that has hired a lobbyist to lobby Congress so that they can maybe get some more tourist dollars. And that makes sense for them. That doesn't make sense for the United States, it make more sense to change the law and to say, you know, since there's no U.S. competitors, maybe it would be okay to allow cruise ships to pick up passengers in San Diego, and maybe if they want to take a cruise up to Seattle, they could do that. But the PVSA prevents them from doing that right now.
so if the PVSA went away, or if this Alaska thing passed and Alaska was exempt, people could, assuming the cruise ships would go along with this, somebody could get on in Whittier, because right now in Alaska we have kind of an issue with our ferry system. There's budget issues, and some of them aren't working, and it's last 4 years our ferry. It actually goes back a lot longer than that, but it's an issue with ferry set schedule and service, and getting folks around coastal communities. If the cruise ships were to allow this, somebody could get on in Whittier and then get off in Juneau instead of having to go all the way
Yeah.
down to. So you could, the cruise ships could maybe, I don't know if they would even want to do that, but they could have a maybe another market of moving people within Alaska or within California, whatever different states. And there's also the obviously the cruise element, but if maybe just somebody wants to take a 2-day trip and they want to go somewhere else and not have to worry about driving or flying.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. We're in Hawaii, we've considered the same thing. Hawaii does not have a robust ferry system. They've got a couple of little ferries, but there's no ferries that visit all of the islands. So that we lost the inter-island ferry a couple of years ago. So if Hawaii were able to get in under Murkowski's bill, you could see maybe a foreign cruise ship. They visit Honolulu all the time, but they visit other ports in Hawaii as well. Maybe someone could hop on in Honolulu, and if they wanted to go to the Big Island, they could do that. But right now, those foreign ships can't make that move because of the PVSA.
Yeah, it just seems I've been to Big Island and Honolulu and Maui or Oahu and Maui. And I was in March, I was in Finland and I went to Estonia and the Baltic Sea, huge sea, and there's a whole kind of network of big ships. I mean they call them ferries, but they're like almost like cruise ships. And it's like $10, 20, it's cheap and you can get, and I don't know, obviously like you said EU, and there's probably some other, some efficiencies with the way they do things there, but it was just so easy to just book a ticket, get on 2-hour ferry, you're from Helsinki to Tallinn. And there's all kinds of these things moving around the Baltic Sea. And it was just very easy. It wasn't even that expensive either.
Yeah, yeah, and Europe, I think, moves something like 40% of its domestic cargo by water. In the United States, I think that number is like 2%. And I mean, there's more than it's not just the Jones Act to blame for that, but the Jones Act plays a part in why we don't move goods by water. It makes it a lot more expensive. PVSA is the same thing.
So what do see happening here in the next? I know COVID kind of made this PVSA thing a little more visible in the public. I mean, do you think this Murkowski bill or will go?
Yeah, I think I would I would love if the Murkowski bill were to pass. And I think that's a function partly of, it's partly what's Congress going to look like, who knows. And it's partly how much she wants to push this issue, because if she's able to get whoever Alaska's representative ends up being, and then Dan Sullivan on board with this, if the entire delegation is pushing for it, it's got a pretty good shot. In Hawaii, one of the problems that we've had in working on this issue is that only one of the 4 members of our congressional delegation, U.S. Representative Ed Case, is actually supportive of Jones Act reform. And so it's been really hard to move the needle on this issue, because most of our delegation supports the Jones Act, and that has a lot to do with the maritime interests.
Yeah, I was going to say, why did the other ones support it? Do they have kind of maritime support or?
Yeah, so there's 2 very large ocean carriers there in Hawaii. You have Matson, you have Pasha, and there's a lot of money involved, which I understand, and which is why one of the reforms we've been pushing for is maybe a domestic build requirement reform. I'll give you an example. Just today, Matson announced that it was going to purchase 3 container ships for $1 billion. So that's $300 million a ship. If Matson were to buy those ships in a shipyard in Asia, they could probably pay closer to $100 million per ship. So that's 3 times less expensive. So if Matson's able to do that, they're able to save money, which in turn for residents of Hawaii, that's going to save them money too, because Matson's not going to pass on the cost of those ships
But Matson,
Hawaii or Alaska.
But Matson and other companies are thinking if they already paid more money to have it built in U.S., or if they're going to buy ships and pay more, they don't want. And that's almost understandable. They don't want to all of a sudden have the law change and then say, "Well, fuck, we just spent $300 million. Now Homeboy is going to come in with a ship for a third of the cost, and he's going to be able to do the same transport."
Yeah, that you're exactly right, and that's that's part of the reason these laws receive support in Congress from Hawaii's delegation. Matson and Pesha do not want the additional competition coming in on those Jones Act trade lanes, which, I mean, I understand, but you have to ask the question, who pays for that?
Well,
And
it's
that's
just
the
like,
consumer.
this is a lot of states have this, and or cities have this, and we Anchorage experienced this several years ago with Uber. We had this medallion permit system for the taxi, and I used to drive a taxi cab in college. And there's this, government market that was created, and you had to have a medallion, and there was only so many of them, and it was kind of a government made market. And then all of a sudden Uber came in, and they eventually let Uber in, and those medallions, the people in some cases spent a lot of money on $100,000, $150,000. All of a sudden overnight became basically worthless.
Yeah.
And the government
Yeah.
didn't, my contention or my argument was, look, let Uber in, fine, but you have to compensate these people who spent this money
Yes.
on these permits. Some people spent more, some people had them a lot longer, and they spent less. You have to find a way to compensate. You can't just, because then people just don't trust the government. And I'd be upset
Yes.
if I was a
Yeah.
company that spent a lot of money on a big ship, and then they said, well, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have fun.
People get upset when you change the rules in the middle of the game. Yeah.
So, I mean,
And
I
so that's
understand
why,
that.
one thing we're talking about is compensation. And there's a question, if the Jones Act is really for national security purposes, for, to benefit the entire country, why are the residents of Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii the ones who are paying for the brunt of the cost? So that's where compensation factors in, I think. Maybe we reform the Jones Act, but we compensate for some of these carriers for buying these really expensive ships. And then if we're going to support U.S. ship owners and U.S. shipyards, maybe let's do that through some sort of national program, as opposed to just forcing the cost onto just a few areas.
So all these huge cargo ships from China or from all over, and they come to like LA or Seattle, these are all US built ships.
Well, if only if it's in domestic trade. If it's moving in international trade, there's a really good chance it's not going to be a U.S. built ship. It's probably going to be from China, Japan, South Korea.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Those are the world's major shipyards.
So are there exemptions again for foreign goods?
Yes. So for imports, the Jones Act doesn't apply. Jones Act, PVSA, they just apply to ships that are moving goods between U.S. ports.
That's interesting. It seems like another kind of strange part of me. So you can have all these other goods
right,
on foreign ships, but not.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be, back in the founding, there were some requirements that foreign trading ships had to, be U.S. built, but I mean, those were repealed over time because people realized that it drove up the cost of shipping. And some people have tried to change the law to require that a certain percent of U.S. Exports or imports be carried on U.S. built ships. And those proposals usually don't get through because people are concerned that it's going to drive up the cost. For example, a couple of years ago, there was a representative from California who proposed a bill to require that U.S. natural gas exports, a certain percentage of those exports had to be carried on U.S. natural gas tankers. And the Government Accountability Office did a study on this, and they said, basically, if you do this, these exporters are going to have a pretty big problem because there's no U.S. flagged natural gas tankers in the Jones Act fleet. There haven't been natural gas tankers built in the United States since, I believe it was the 1980s. So if we have any in the fleet, they're extremely old. And there would have to be a lot more built if we were going to export natural gas off them. So that proposal got shut down because it would have the cost of natural gas, and the energy sector.
Sorry, you kind of
not on board with that.
A little bit of a connection issue. Say the last part again.
I was going to say the energy sector was not on board with having that requirement that a certain percent of natural gas exports be carried on U.S. built
That's actually interesting right now because for decades and 40, 50 years we've been talking about a gas line in Alaska, and it's never gotten done. It's gotten close a few times. There's been last governor had to deal with China that kind of fell apart. There's been stuff with other Asia, but now with Putin and Ukraine, and there's some more renewed interest in maybe doing this thing, which I'm always apprehensive because every governor has some idea about it. But if it were to get built, I mean, the export market is Asia. It's Japan and Korea. So I guess I wonder how that would what would be in that case. It's exporting to a foreign, so basically any ship, right, could do it.
Yeah, it would be any ship. I mean, it's possible you might see some people calling for some of those cargoes to be reserved for U.S. ships, but I mean, it's unlikely that that's going to pass because the oil exporters are going to say, "Hey, that's going to increase our costs and it's going to make us less globally competitive."
Well, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm glad I'm glad how'd you come across do you have like a little, what's it called? Like a Google alert for
Yeah,
Jones
no,
Act?
I've got Google Alerts set up for PVSA and Jones Act. So a lot of times people mention these issues and they get them wrong. And so I try to reach out and say, hey, especially with the PVSA, right? It's confusing as all get out. And so, if a writer doesn't understand it, I try to reach out and say, hey, I think you're missing some of the intricacies of the law. And so I hope I've been helpful in that.
Yeah, no, it's good to chat. Like I said, I mean, I think a lot of Alaskans have heard of Jones Act and recently PVSA with the COVID, but the intricacies, like anything else, when you dig into it, it's pretty fast. I mean, I didn't even realize there was this distant port versus close port thing, and um, I really hope this Murkowski bill goes somewhere because I think for Alaska, this could be a big, positive impact.
Yeah. I mean, I hope it does too. It doesn't include Hawaii right now, but I mean, even if it passes just for Alaska, that's an example for us to point to say, hey, this is working for Alaska. Why can't we try something similar for Hawaii?
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you for coming on and chatting with me about this very fascinating topic, and I think it's something that impacts almost all Alaskans, and actually basically everybody in the country. So, you want to go on a cruise?
Yeah, it does.
Buy some goods. Well, keep in touch, and thanks for talking. And if you have any updates, and if there's any movement on this bill next Congress, we can chat again.
That sounds good, Jeff. I appreciate it.